Thank you. Until Trudy just sat in the front, I was sitting here this morning, and this empty bench reminded me of that quote, I think it's by Betjeman, who says that the first row of pews in any church is reserved for the people who never show up. Right. I'm sure you all are very familiar with the quote on the screen by Thomas Hardy. It certainly raises the issue that the ultimate dilemma isn't just the nature of the buildings themselves, but actually the nature of our different perspectives and the values that we ascribe to them. In this paper, my perspective will be to take a brief look. I mean, it's a relatively cursory look, but I hope will build quite nicely on some of the themes that Anne Ritchie's was talking about this morning. I also confess, I know you should never start a lecture with an apology, that it's not specifically on medieval church heritage. This is looking at what's happened to buildings that have closed. So I will look at them as a group, if you like. This audience, obviously, is very familiar with the introduction of the pastoral measure in 1969, which followed on from the Bridges report and enabled greater flexibility in the range of options available for reusing Anglican churches. It set up the advisory board that Anne commented on, and it set up the Redundant Churches Fund, which was highlighted by the Council of Europe in 1989 as a worthy model for other countries to follow. And you will hear from its successor body to that, the Churches Conservation Trust, next. This system for closure was augmented by the revised pastoral in 1983 and superseded by the pastoral measure of 2011, which came into force last summer. I'm sure if I get any of this wrong. This system is concerned with the future of the parish as a whole rather than the building itself, although what I'm talking about is the buildings themselves. The presence of this system requires recording of detailed information by the church commissioners, and I have to say superhuman effort on the part of the closed churches section has led to the computerisation of all of their pastoral measure records since 1969 over the last few years, and I owe them a particular debt of gratitude for providing unfettered and very generous access to their material. And I'd just like to particularly thank Andrew Mulkeen and Fiona Mackenzie for their support and guidance. I have to say all the errors in this paper statistically will be my own, but they've been very supportive in trying to get me to an accurate place. I feel like I should set out my stall slightly at the beginning. Firstly, I've given versions of this sort of paper before, although this is different. This is always a work in progress, it seems to me, trying to work out what's happening over time and trying to work out what are the right questions to ask of this data. And although I'm asking quite high-level questions at this stage, one of the things that I'd like to do is sort of work out what would be the right questions that we could use from the evidence we have to date in order to work out what we need to do next. So it's a basic introduction to what the data can tell us. Secondly, and this is a sort of, I feel there are a couple of things I'm going to say today. I have no idea whether you're going to be a sympathetic audience to or not. One of them is that I think talking about extended use, I'll call it for now, the extended use agenda that the Church Buildings Council talked about earlier, and reuse separately rather misses the point. They're two sides of the same coin for me. They're not necessarily two sides of the same coin for a parish priest. I'm perfectly prepared to accept that. But if you're looking at these in terms of a building's lifestyle, some of the issues that are relevant to working out what a reuse solution might be are the same sets of issues about working out whether a particular extended use solution would work in a building. Thirdly, I am from English heritage. I'm not representing a church body, and therefore much of this focuses on listed status and protection of churches as heritage assets, and I hope taking a sort of strategic overview of the state of play. My paper is divided into 5 short parts, pleased to hear. I have a sort of 3 aims, I suppose. The first 3 sections of the paper will address the first aim, which is simply to set out the basic facts of what's been happening. So I look at church closure since 1969, what happens to closed churches, and where does it happen, very briefly. I'll then go on to talk about emerging trends. So what does the information we have now tell us about where we're headed? Accepting, as Anne has rightly pointed out, it's sort of impossible to predict, but I think there are some kind of issues that are clearer than others. And finally, just to raise a question about what further evidence would be helpful, or do you all think this is a complete waste of time? I don't, but it would be really useful to get some feedback on where we should go next on asking some of those bigger strategic questions. As you've heard from Anne, since 1969, 1,865 churches have been closed, representing approximately 11% of the Anglican building stock. I'm quite pleased, actually, to have the slot straight after coffee, because I think you need the caffeine to get through the amount of graphs that I'm about to show you. They're there to prove that I did do some analysis for some of this, but also to make it look slightly prettier, and it might just be easier to take in rather than me just read a whole bunch of statistics out at you. Just over a third of all closed churches are highly graded listed buildings. A quarter are grade 2, and just over a third are unlisted. This figure, I have to say, is a different number from, as Anne has said actually, a different number from those for which an active use has been found. And that figure, I can't remember what it is, 95 less than this figure up here, so you can do the maths. These figures, it seems to me, need to be understood in the context of the estate that the Church of England holds. This shows us that 65% of closed churches are listed buildings. Approximately 76% of the Anglican church estate is listed. Decision on closure, therefore, tends to be, this is an obvious statement, tends to be driven by pastoral and political, by which I mean local diocesan political rather than larger political considerations, rather than anything to do with planning constraints or listed building status. Now, given that so many of the Church of England buildings are listed, that is perhaps not surprising. On first glance, therefore, one might conclude from this that listing doesn't act as a barrier to closure. It doesn't act as a constraint. I know people don't like the word constraint, but that's what it is. So, in planning constraint terms, that is what it's called. However, to contextualise this a little bit further, I show you this little graph. And the astute among you, Trevor's probably adding the figures, last year's figures.
Not this year's figures, so there's a discrepancy of 20 in the figure I've just given you, so I apologise for that. 5% of grade 1 buildings have been closed, 10% of grade 2 star buildings, and 11.5% of grade 2 have been closed. 22% of unlisted churches have been closed. Therefore, listed status does provide protection against closure, in fact. And overall, the higher the grade, the less likely it is to be closed. I mean, that's just a simple fact. There may be very many reasons for that. But that's how it looks at the moment, anyway. This graph, this might actually be one that the Church Commissioners did for me rather than I did myself, but it's the one that I wanted when I was working for English Heritage, and I had endless conversations in meetings about the fact that we're at the sort of church closure equivalent of the fiscal cliff, that somehow church closure is going to go right back up to 1970s levels almost immediately. And in fact, in my years of working for the Church of England, which was my job previous to English Heritage, we were always having those discussions as well. And so I wanted this graph to prove that we're not doing that we're not currently going back to the levels of the 1970s. And whilst I think all of Marcus Binney's work was sort of brilliant and absolutely apposite at the time, we need to be careful about not scaremongering too much. Now, this graph, like all statistics, has to be put in context. So on one hand, I think it's very helpful because it shows us that this high rate of closure has dropped and that this drop is being maintained. However, the longer perspective tells us that the reason there was a peak was because there were loads of churches waiting to close with very reduced opportunities for reuse, and it was the introduction of the pastoral measure that enabled them all to go through that. So, you know, you can use it, like all statistics, how you like, really. But the trend has levelled off since the introduction of the pastoral measure report, and that's certainly a good thing. And it's interesting that at the beginning of the period, the sort of first 10 to 20 years after the pastoral measure, the number of highly graded buildings was much higher than it is now. So there clearly was this kind of glut of really important buildings that just had no sort of discernible future in the 1950s. The influence of demographic change is one, and much of the church closure of the 50s was in fact attributed to depopulation and perhaps more financial burden on communities. 1600, for example, Norfolk had lost 16% of all of its parish churches. Then, migration and depopulation were perhaps the most significant factors affecting the relationship between a parish church and its community. What I'm showing you here is simply, it's sort of self-explanatory, but it's simply a representation of the census figures, so the shift in people who say they are of no religion or of a Christian religion or indeed of other religious groups. And I show it simply like this to make the very obvious point of the 83% rise in the number of people who say that they have no religion, the drop in the number of people who describe themselves as Christian, and the rise in all of the other groups. So it's to make a simple point that's been much publicised in the news lately, really. So whilst we've looked at that previous graph and said the levels are balancing off, looking like the situation has improved, this does need to be seen within this much bigger context of societal change that, quite frankly, is leading to a continual decline in some Christian religious observance in the 20th century. I struggled with that sentence simply on the basis that everyone talks about secularisation as if somehow all global religions are moving towards a state of secularisation. And actually, there are certain Christian groups, even within this country, as we know, that are on the rise, and I just think we need to be very careful about not making generalisations. So I think it's particularly looking at some of the Christian groups and the decline in specific kinds of religious observance, and in Western Europe as well. As a result of this, as we've heard already, the geographic distribution of churches has not come into balance with the population that uses it. This situation is by no means unique to England. In the Netherlands, since 1200, 19,000 churches were constructed. By 2007, 4,240 were left. That's Roman Catholic and Protestant combined. Furthermore, it is currently being predicted in the Netherlands that over the next 6 years, 1,200 churches may close, so a rate of about 2 a week. If you look at the figures that we're currently faced with, of between, I keep glancing over to the church commissioners, but between 18 and 28, let's say, a year, it doesn't look quite so horrific as the sort of, the problems that in some other countries. Which doesn't mean that it isn't a problem, but sometimes I think it's helpful to look around and look at the bigger context. In fact, if we carried on, I can't do the maths now in my head, but if we carried on at the current rate, it would take us nearly 700 years to get to that situation. Which again doesn't mean, no trend carries on in a straight line, but just to make the point that we're not right at the edge of complete, everything falling apart.
I meant to put in an extra slide here, actually, from the New Economics Foundation, which showed the decline in other local resources, so banks, post office and pubs, over the same period as churches. And they have all declined. In fact, pubs, I think, is 18 a week rather than 18 a year, although there are 55,000 of them, so they've got a bit more wriggle room. But the decline in those kinds of place-based local functions is declining across the board. Which in itself may or may not be a result of the fact that we live in a slightly more network society, allegedly, rather than a place-based society. But it raises the issue that it isn't unique to churches either. And this is simply making the point, I don't like what this slide is saying, but I sort of quite like the slide, in that the shift is from the people of no religion. So I don't know whether you can read this, I'm just going to explain. Basically, the more yellow a part of the country is, the smaller the percentage of people who have no religion is. So about 10% of the people in the yellow area say, I have no religion in 2001. The more red you get, and the more blue, the larger the proportion of people saying that they have no religion. So this shows very clearly the shift from 2001 to 2011. Although I'd be very, very pleased if anyone could explain to me why that little bit of Wales and North Norfolk are completely blue. So one wonders what's happened to the religious observance in those parts of the countries. But I think this shows very clearly that there's this massive shift, and there's no point in ignoring it, really. Although way beyond the scope of this paper, I would add that there is arguably a significant difference between people of no religion, as stated in the national census, and people's interaction with both a national religion or indeed a myriad of religious organisations and social facilities generally. So I'm making no judgment here on whether people who claim to have no religion ever use or reap the benefit of the contribution of religion to society. But this is the question the census asked. So what happened to closed churches? The first thing to say is that for over half of the closed churches, a new use has been found. Over a fifth of them have been demolished, and 1/5 have been preserved. I put that in inverted commas. It's a contested term, but it's the term used in the Commissioner's database, so I'm going to use it for the purposes of this paper. A fifth have been preserved, largely but not exclusively, by the Church's Conservation Trust. Just looking at that figure of demolitions, 20% sounds quite high, but of the demolished buildings, 3/4 are unlisted, indicating, as certainly one from English Heritage might hope, that listed status is an effective protection mechanism in preventing complete loss. Furthermore,
As the trends graph shows, which is the one on the right, 73% of all of these demolitions took place within the first 20 years of the measure being introduced. And the numbers of demolitions are annually generally much, much lower now, as you can clearly see. Again, if one compares this figure of 1/5, just to get a perspective on the issue, to what's going on in the rest of Europe, it is noteworthy that apparently 53% of all closed Roman Catholic churches in the Netherlands have been demolished. Now, this may be, and I'm sure it is, a result of theological approaches to reuse of buildings, but which, you know, one can have a debate about that. In fact, people who deal in canon law talk about it all the time, it seems to me. But it is an argument for saying that what has been done at a local and a national level with the churches in England is actually a huge effort to ensure that that isn't the case, and that the assets themselves do remain in some form, even if they're no longer primarily used as a place of worship. So what do these buildings turn into? The Commissioner's database is sort of charming and incredibly complicated, and it has a very large number of terms to define what a reuse is. So for the sake of simplicity and a legible pie chart, I've coalesced these into the following groups of community use, monument, ecclesiastical, which can mean a whole range of things from private chapel to reuse by a different Christian organisation, residential, light industrial storage, and then there's always an other category in all databases, so there's an other category in this one as well. Community use, residential and ecclesiastical are clearly the biggest uses, each accounting for 1/4 of all closed churches for which an active use is found. So I've taken out all of the statistics that are to do with vesting in the Church's Conservation Trust and demolition. This is just about that 53% for which an active use has been found. Just to give you a sort of sense of what's happening to them. A rapid overview of where these are. This is a question that I've only just started to look at, which is why this is a very simplistic way of assessing it. But where, in terms of settlement type,
percent of those are in a rural location, 38% in an urban location, which is a city or a town or an estate. And for the purposes of this, I separated out suburban and urban fringe. But if you amalgamated them and just said, is it in a town, is it rural, you can see that it's not quite half and half, but it doesn't have quite the differential that perhaps I was expecting when I started looking at the figures. Given that the English Heritage at Risk Survey of 2010 for places of worship, we stated that rural churches were more likely to be at risk, by which we meant in very poor condition, than urban ones, and that related to that, highly graded ones were more likely to be at risk. One could interpret this as suggesting that there is no obvious link between condition and closure. Nobody breathed in, actually. That's one of the things I thought you'd all jump down my throat about, interestingly. However, looked at another way, given that the highest grades of listed buildings are less likely to be closed, and that those are predominantly rural, it may simply be that these are the areas where people are working hardest to maintain their buildings, but faced with enormous challenges. So it's another problem with showing these sort of graphs, is that one wouldn't wish to take an automatic line that these things have direct correlations. I did just do a quick analysis to see where different types of conversions are happening, and this shows some of the general tendencies. I mean, I feel in some ways they're not particularly surprising, but I've just never seen it written down. So for me, it was quite a useful process. So just to sort of pick a couple of the obvious ones, I hope you appreciate the time and effort I took to put these in order, so it was easy for you to read. So for those of you who can't read the writing for any reason, the blue is if it's in a city, the town is red, and yellow is rural. And OCB on your far left means other Christian bodies, so which is self-explanatory, I think. And again, I've amalgamated some of the categories into sort of overall type. Monuments are predominantly rural. Perhaps that's not surprising at all, and also predominantly listed. Community uses are predominantly town and suburb, and not in inner cities particularly. The listed church buildings in these areas are more likely to be used for community use than anything else. Residential is also predominantly rural, and these conversions affect mostly Grade 2 and unlisted churches. Which of these is considered to be most sustainable and in what locations is a question that I would like to have answered in much more detail than this slide could ever attempt to show. And I wonder whether we could get more information to help fast track into decisions of most likely solutions for sustainability.
Like I say, this isn't subtle enough for that, but I think there are possible questions underneath this where we could do much more analysis. Added to which, any discussion along these lines would need to be clear on what is meant by sustainable. And if the recent debates over the drafting of the PP are anything to go by, this remains a highly contested term. One view could be that residential is the most sustainable because economically it's highly viable, and community may be perceived commonly or used by other Christian bodies as the most heritage-friendly solution, but all of these reuse solutions raise their own issues, and what the impact of the character of this is over the longer term for all of these solutions, I think is an issue that it would be beneficial to study in more detail. Work in Cornwall by English Heritage over recent years has concentrated on trying to see how easy it is to address some of these questions about location in more detail. One of the conclusions from the study was that ongoing trends in the spatial organisation of the economy imply genuine difficulties for the identification of alternative uses for the reuse in churches and chapels in Cornwall, which are also sympathetic to the maintenance of their heritage value. Or put another way, most of them end up being residential accommodation. And this is in fact why residential accommodation is more common in rural areas. And it seems to me that the rural issue does remain a particular challenge, and that is a part of my paper which I think does tie up with the issue of medieval buildings particularly. A recent policy document from the Church of Sweden highlights the same issue, of why invest in seeking a community use of a building without a community, hence residential conversion being the most likely outcome in areas of high dispersed settlements. There are other conclusions to this paper too, but, which I don't really have time to go into, unfortunately. But having that kind of research locally about what's happening can act as a benchmark for the issues that we really need to address and make sure that we give advice in the right areas to local authorities. And it comes back to this issue that the moment a building is closed, it goes from exemption into secular listed building control. And that there's a real tension point there between that, in that shift, and that there is a lot of help that I think is needed to ensure that local authorities are making sound evidence-based decisions. And it seems to be the responsibility of many of the organisations in this room to help them do that.
Right, I'm going to quickly run through emerging trends. I think from memory I have three. So the current indications are that the trend has been for a decreasing number of listed buildings over the past 43 years. There has been a commensurate increase in numbers of unlisted buildings being closed. So I'm sure this makes perfect sense, but it isn't that everything is being affected equally by that decline. It is interesting that more unlisted are closed proportionally now than at the beginning, which is encouraging and somewhat surprising in a way. This downward trend, however, is gradually flattening off in my view. There has been a rise in the number of Grade 2 churches being closed, for example. So the graph that you're looking at now is simply Grade 1 is the blue, Grade 2 star is the pink, and Grade 2 is the yellow. And obviously, because of the numbers we're talking about, it fluctuates. But I think if you look at the overall trends, then it's fairly clear. This may be an indication, she says hesitantly, that we are entering a phase with an increase in the numbers of listed buildings being closed, although at the moment, this still appears to be weighted towards those listed at the lower grades. But it's definitely something I think we need to kind of keep an eye on. It is perhaps not surprising, given the over-churching that occurred in the 19th century, that 19th century church buildings closures account for a significant proportion of all closed churches. And in line with the overall statistics, the absolute numbers have reduced considerably during the operation of the pastoral measure. However, the proportion of Grade 2 19th century buildings has doubled in the last 20 years in terms of closed buildings. A comparable analysis of what is happening to 20th century churches reveals a noticeable shift as well, in fact a larger shift. The actual number of 20th century churches closed has increased by about 10%, despite the significant decline in annual figures generally. The proportion of listed 20th century buildings has more than doubled, I should say closed obviously, the proportion of listed 20th century buildings that are closed has more than doubled in the last 20 years. 20th century churches are arguably often seen as a soft target for closure. And as a consequence, I think many people would agree are probably underdesignated. So that's the first two trends. And the third one I just want to spend a minute on is this issue about use by other Christian bodies.
there's a clear indication that the use of places of worship by other Christian bodies has been rising, and more quickly than any other individual or collective future use. In the first 20 years of the pastoral measure, these closures accounted for 5.5%. This use accounted for 5.5% of all closures. In the subsequent 10, it was 11%, and in the last 11 years, 14%. And it is the clearest rise of any use. It's quite distinctive when you start looking at the figures. I'll explain this graph in a second. There is a clear indication that the rise in numbers of buildings is a rise in the numbers of listed buildings being taken over by these bodies. So what you have here is a bunch of squiggly lines to show you that I did actually break it down into listed and unlisted. So pink is, I can't read this myself actually, pink is unlisted, blue is listed, and yellow is the total in this case. But you can sort of ignore those in one sense, and what you need to do is look at the straight lines, and the black line is the trends analysis for the number of unlisted buildings taken over by other Christian bodies, which is indeed flat. So all of the increase in the last few years has been taken up by the green line, which is the trends analysis of the number of listed buildings being taken over by these bodies. Predominantly, this is a rise in the use of Grade 2 buildings by other Christian bodies, but there is a noticeable, although lesser, rise in Grade 2 star. This trend raises a number of particular issues about the relationship between new building owners and their places of worship, which is perhaps more of relevance to English heritage and local planning authorities than it is necessarily to individual dioceses once the building is no longer used. So it's sort of beyond the scope of this day, really, to talk about that. But it remains a real issue if you're considering these as what happens to the heritage asset, as well as what happens to the mission and worship. It is likely to be possible to do some more targeted work on helping to protect the special character of churches still in use as churches, but now falling within the secular listed building system. So what evidence would help? Well, I should have just left that, and then you could fill in the blanks, really, because I'd be quite interested to know what you think would help, really. Thomas Erne, a German theologian, recently stated, "It is assumed that churches are a sign of the general social acceptance of religion, and as effective symbols in use, they should be preserved. But they must not run contrary to the character of the building." So, as ever, the core of the issue is defining character through identifying agreed, accepted values.
So what evidence would help with the practicality of managing sound, sustainable decision-making and streamlining everyone's efforts for seeking extended use or reuse solutions? This is very much flagged as suggestions rather than a must-do list, I have to say. I know this looks a bit old hat, but I still struggle with the point that we don't really agree on the terms that we're using. And whenever I have discussions about sustainability, I do seem to mean something different to everybody else. So either I'm out of step or we're all just in a different place. And the concept of authenticity is a very, very difficult one in the church context as well. So I still think there is a debate to be had here with interested parties and stakeholders. The second thing, I think this was alluded to perhaps by speakers earlier, understanding the effectiveness of extended or shared use agenda in preventing closure. I went to a paper recently where somebody said, is taking out the pews and putting in new facilities and turning it into a community space step-by-step closure? I know that's a potentially controversial point, but I think it's an important question to ask. I'm sure you all know this quote by Larkin from his account of visiting a church. "Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for." So how can we ensure that the change we are making to buildings that are in use don't lead us down that path? So by the time they are closed, we've lost the special character that we wanted to protect in the first place. Nobody's thrown anything at me, that's great. The third point is understanding the sustainability of reuse solutions once closed and their impact on character. And I think for me, this is a very practical issue about what works, how long does it work, how are people maintaining those buildings over time. And actually, with the database that the Church Commissioners now own and manage, I think that sort of work is potentially possible. And fourthly and lastly, and I know that Trevor Cooper's own work has started to look at some of these issues, but considering areas, by which I mean geographical territories, in terms of social, economic and demographic profile to assess viability of both extended use or reuse solutions.
the nature of the settlement, how many other mixed-use community spaces are there in a 10-mile radius, what is the business plan for whether this is going to work, where is investment happening in a particular territory, to help make those decisions so that each parish or each time the church commissioners have to face these questions, the same questions aren't asked over and over again without some of that local knowledge and context. Thank you, that's it.